Hello, welcome to Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook Reopened. We are going way back in history for this one, Fred.
You can say that again. George Joseph Smith, the brides in the bath murderer. Serial bigamist, serial killer. And the unique thing about this one is it all happened in the early 1900s, way before, would you believe, even my time. And I can't often say that.
George Joseph Smith was a charmer and, of course, a con man and a killer.
Women were his murderous habit, and he would kill time after time after time.
Drowning in a bath is a very unpleasant way to die.
We don't know that much about his early life. We think that maybe he was a bit of a petty criminal growing up, but he pops up in the records around kind of 1910.
Yes, he had a few convictions for petty larceny, this sort of thing. Smart man, con man, smooth talker, really smooth talker. A man with tremendous greed, a tremendous need for money and possessions. In 1910 is where he first crops up, as far as we're concerned, in Weymouth, where he married a lady called Bessie Mundy. Now, Bessie Mundy, well, as Professor David Wilson, when he speaks in this murder casebook that we originally made all those years ago, he described her as being on the shelf, a woman on the shelf, a very old-fashioned expression for a woman who perhaps is, maybe feels she's past her prime. And this was a time when women sort of had the need to be married. I mean, men were so kind of in the ascendancy in those days, you know, women's role was very subservient. So a woman, it's changed completely rightly now, of course, but a woman in those days would feel the need to be married. And Bessie was getting on a bit and felt the need to be married.
So tell me about the sort of women that would have attracted Smith, that would be ideal for his particular purpose.
Well, by and large, we can use that old-fashioned phrase that these were women on the shelf. We're talking about women who were in their 30s, their late 30s, women who felt that they were never going to get a husband for one reason or another, and therefore were flattered that somebody who claimed to be an artist, an antique dealer, was going to take an interest in them.
I think she was quite vulnerable too, by the sounds of it. I get the impression that she perhaps wasn't very bright, didn't maybe have many resources of her own, and was kind of almost under the care of other relatives.
She was, and the thing about George Joseph Smith is, which obviously she didn't realise, was that he'd been married 4 times already. He'd had 4 wives. He was a bigamist 4 times over, incredibly so.
You spoke with author Jane Robbins, who's written about this case, and she said that he was posing as an art critic and an antiques dealer and was very plausible.
He was a very charming man. He presented himself fairly well. He looked smart when he wanted to. He would wear a very fancy frock coat and a silk hat and gold chains. And so in many ways he was very plausible. He persuaded each woman that she was the love of his life, and in each case they fell for it, and very often he was married within a few weeks, and these women were conned out of all of their money very, very quickly.
He was incredibly plausible, and of course every time he got married he would change his name. But this was a different time, you see. We're talking about a time before social media, before TV, of course. Really, even before great circulation newspapers. I mean, people tended to read what was in the local news. So anyone who moved around a bit, as George Smith did, and changed their names, would get away with it.
Yeah, I guess there were no centralised record systems. You
No.
interviewed lawyer Lois Bibbings, and she told you that actually it would have just been very easy to move from area to area, change your name, and really it would be very hard for anyone to join up the dots that you'd been marrying different people in different places.
Absolutely, which is exactly what George Smith relied on. So he just moved from town to town, find a different bride, change his name. Bob's your uncle.
Well, identity wasn't as easily provable in those days, and actually people changed their names and their identity far more than now. So it would largely be a case of turning up and sort of giving notice for a civil wedding, and that notice sort of appearing so that anyone could contest it.
And if you moved around the country as he did, would that make it even easier to get married, as it were, several times, and even less chance of being detected?
Absolutely. Moving around would obviously make it much easier not to be detected. And changing your name would help as well, but I don't think that would even be necessary at that stage. It'd be very unlikely to be detected.
In each case, he'd married a woman who'd got a few pounds in the bank, and he'd taken the money and run. So when he got to Bessie, she was going to be bride number 5. Bessie was slightly different to the previous ones. As you say, she was a simple sort of soul in need of a man, but she did have in trust £2,500, which had been put in trust for her by her father. Now, it didn't take George Joseph Smith long to discover this, and he was determined to get his hands on that £2,500. May not seem a fortune today, but we're going back to 1910, and it was a colossal amount of money in those days. Well over £100,000, I believe. And that's what he was after. But in actual fact, it wasn't easy to get hold of that money, and her father couldn't be persuaded to release the money. So George Joseph Smith, in a sense, lost interest and left, went away and deserted her, really.
Taking any money that she had and her clothing with him.
About £150 of her money, which again was worth much more than it is worth today, and some of her clothing, which he spent the money on himself and sold the clothing. But eventually came back to her a little bit later on when the money he had got had run out, came back to her, wooed her again. She fell for it, and he took her to Herne Bay in Kent. And that's where they started to settle down.
So poor Bessie Mundy, we've got 1912 and they've reunited. They've moved to Herne Bay.
Yeah.
And he persuades her to write to her relatives saying, firstly, that she's having a breakdown, and secondly, that if she dies, she wants to leave everything to her husband in her will, including that £2,500 trust fund.
Yeah, so, I mean, Bessie's fallen for it completely. Mysteriously, she sort of fell ill. Didn't feel very well. So whether he had something to do with that or not, we shall never know. So he'd taken her to the doctors. The doctor had examined her. So she was on the doctor's radar, as it were. He'd remembered that he'd seen her. George Smith took her home, said to her, darling, I imagine he said to her, darling, how about a nice hot, you're not very well, how about a nice hot bath? Which was a bit of a luxury in those days because not every house had a bath, with running water and all that. So he ran her a nice hot bath. Bessie got into the bath and mysteriously drowned.
So after her death, the same doctor who'd seen her when she was ill came back, Dr. French, and he couldn't find any suspicious circumstances, and it was no alarms were raised.
No alarms were raised at all. Bessie had died under natural circumstances, as it were, or mysterious circumstances, but no proof of any murder or anything like that. And of course, George now had, because of the change in the will, George now had access to her fortune of £2,500, which was worth a great deal more then, much more then, than it ever is now. So he was free to go off and do what he wanted to do, be the man about town, spend his money, which he did rather too quickly.
The first thing he did was he returned to Bristol for a little while, where his third wife, Edith Pegler, lived, and he visited her and he gave her some clothes that he'd clearly taken from other women, visited her for a while, and then off he went into the night again.
Interesting, the relationship, wasn't it, he had with Edith Pegler, who was described as being slightly overweight, not particularly attractive, but he was obviously quite fond of her, wasn't he? Because she remained completely unscathed. And he would tend to give her money as opposed to conning her out of her own money. Interesting situation, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, and David Wilson, the criminologist you spoke with for this programme, said that Smith would explain these absences where he would disappear from his various wives' lives by saying that he was working abroad, he was going to look at some art, to buy some antiques, and so he would just disappear for periods of time. And these women seemed largely to accept that.
Yeah, well, difficult to track anyone down, you see. The days long before mobile phones and keeping in touch with people on social media and this sort of thing, it would be very easy to say, look, I've got to go abroad, I've got to do this, that or the other. No way of checking, is there really? And so he could get away with it. And also, the role of the male in those days was different. The male was domineering, was all powerful. It's all changed now, of course, quite rightly, I hasten to add.
Surely Edith Pegler would have been suspicious of him.
Well, but remember, it's a time when most people would have read regional or local newspapers rather than national newspapers. So, of course, Edith wouldn't have been suspicious if she had a plausible husband who was explaining his absences by saying he was abroad dealing in art or dealing in antiques.
And then he met a lady called Alice Burnham. 25 she was, so somewhat younger than his previous bride.
But still vulnerable by the sounds of it.
Very vulnerable, because the suggestion was that she was suffering from some sort of sexual disease, which was quite rife at the time. So a very vulnerable lady, but again, a lady with a few pounds in the bank. So just the sort of target that George Smith would aim for. Married her, again under a different name.
Persuaded her to take out a life insurance policy.
Exactly. Very clever. Take out a life insurance policy, my darling. Yes, of course I will, because she was pleased to have him. Pleased to have this man as a husband with all the problems that she had. Took her on honeymoon to Blackpool. One evening said to her, how about a nice hot bath? Would you like that, darling? Oh, yes, please. I'll run the bath for you. In you get. In she got.
So they were staying in a boarding house, and apparently the landlady was downstairs sitting in the living room having a cup of tea, and she actually noticed water running down the walls, and it seemed as though something was overflowing in the guest room above. But they hesitated to go up and knock on the door. They didn't want to disturb these newlyweds in their honeymoon suite.
No, they didn't. She saw this bit of water coming down the wall. She thought, oh, they've let the bath go too high. Presumably it was some water that had splashed out the bath that George Smith had done for Alice. But as you say, the landlady didn't want to cause a fuss, didn't want to upset what she saw as rather posh, rather nice guests. So let it be. If she had gone upstairs, if she had knocked on the door, she might just have saved Alice's life.
So before she died, poor Alice Burnham actually wrote about her new husband to her family.
Yeah, because she said she'd married the best man she could possibly find, you see, because he was a con man. He was very good. He was smart. He was good looking, smooth talking. You know, he was every woman's dream, particularly women of a certain age who were looking to get married and find the man of their dreams. And as far as she was concerned, he was the man of her dreams, which is equally true about his next victim, a lady called Margaret Lofty, 34 years of age. He just was the man of her dreams. Married her. Even before they got married, he took out a life insurance on her. Married, went to live in Highgate in London, and a day later, Margaret drowned in the bath.
He really didn't hang around this time.
No, he didn't. But where he was clever, do you know where he was clever, George Smith, was when his partners had drowned in the bath, he immediately went to the local shop, wherever he was, and bought something so that he'd be remembered by the shopkeeper. So if there were any recriminations, if the police did happen to get involved or anything, he could say, well, she drowned in the bath, but I wasn't there because at that particular time, I was in the local shop. Go and ask the shopkeeper. Oh, yeah, I do remember that guy coming in at 11:15. Yeah, he did. He'd got his inbuilt alibi. He was a clever man, was George Smith.
So Alice Burnham's death was recorded as death by drowning, and it was seen as being accidental. There was no suspicious circumstances. You actually met with pathologist Stuart Hamilton, who showed you what happens to the lungs when someone drowns.
Yes, it was a fascinating experiment, this, because he'd got the lungs of a sheep, which are very similar to human lungs, and he simply poured some water down what would be the throat into the lungs, and instantly the lungs expanded full of water, and that's what would happen in a human being if they were dragged under the water in a bath. Almost instantly the lungs would fill with water, you'd be unable to breathe, and as Stuart Hamilton said, drowning would be an extremely painful death. Because your lungs are trying desperately to breathe, but they can't because they're full of water. be an incredibly painful way to go.
Terrifying too.
Terrifying, absolutely scary, but there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing you can do about it.
Drowning in a bath is an unusual occurrence. Stewart's arranged an experiment to demonstrate what would have happened to Smith's brides when they were drowned.
What we've got here is some lungs, trachea and the heart from a sheep.
Fairly similar to a human being's.
Pretty much the same in all mammals, really. And these lungs will expand as you breathe in, and they'll contract as you breathe out, and keeping the oxygen travelling around your body, keeping you alive.
But if water gets in there, show us what happens.
Then, as we put the water in, we squeeze it. You can see those lungs inflating with the water actually filling them up. And just as an example, when you do resuscitation on somebody who's partially drowned, what you're trying to do is compress the chest so that water comes out and it leaves more room for the air to get in and to allow you to breathe.
But once the water's going in, there's no way that you can breathe.
No. And that water rushing in, it's going to hit the lungs. It's going to be painful. Just think of what happens if you just accidentally inhale a little bit of a drink or something like that. You get that burning sensation in your chest. And this spongy sort of area is all tiny little spaces that should be getting air into them, and they'll all be full of water and they'll be absolutely useless. A very unpleasant way to die. You will be fighting for breath, you'll be fighting for air, you will actually be doing the movements of breathing as your body tries to pull in the air, and you'll just be pulling in more water. It would be a very unpleasant death.
Is drowning, especially forcible drowning, easy to prove?
Remarkably, drowning is not an easy diagnosis to make. There's nothing you can see in a human body specifically which tells you a person must have drowned. And what you've got to look at is the findings in the lungs, the finding elsewhere in the body, and the circumstances in which somebody's found.
So he marries Margaret Lofty, and then she dies just a day later. And this time, a national paper picks up on the story, and this is something that had never happened before.
No, now this is interesting because this is where he made his mistake in carrying out the murder in London, because the case reached the news of the world. The news of the world made a big thing out of the drowning in the bath of Margaret Lofty. It made headlines in the news of the world, and people saw the news. There was no national TV, no national anything in those days, but the news of the world was seen by quite a large audience. And so members of the families of all three victims saw this article in the news of the world, and it alerted their suspicions as to what had happened to their loved ones. Arthur Conan Doyle, the legendary Arthur Conan Doyle, saw it as well, and he found it very, very suspicious.
Alice Burnham's father actually went to his local police station and said, this can't be a coincidence that this young woman has been drowned in London just after her wedding in the exact same way as my daughter drowned just after her wedding.
Exactly. Then the police got involved, a particularly inventive police officer, D.I. Neal, Detective Inspector Neal, who interviewed over 150 different people, really started to investigate George Smith, found numerous bank accounts, discovered all the aliases, the wedding certificates, etc., and realised here there was something incredibly suspicious going on, and that in actual fact George Smith was responsible for the deaths of three of his wives.
So the 1st of February 1915, he was arrested on suspicion of these three murders. But actually what they needed was evidence, because at the moment everything's fairly circumstantial. He's got married, these women have died, their death certificates haven't flagged any suspicious circumstances. So they bring in the first ever really Home Office pathologist, a guy called Sir Bernard Spilsbury.
Yes, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the Home Office pathologist, who claimed that on Bessie's skin he'd found something very, very suspicious. But it was all a little bit pie in the sky, wasn't it, really?
I guess at the time there was no science to counter it, so no one could really argue with what he was saying, but they'd exhumed Bessie's body, and she'd been dead a little while by this point.
Yes.
And he claimed that there was a sort of texture, a kind of goosebumps on her skin.
Goosebumps on the skin.
That was a sign of kind of a sudden death. But what the mystery that everyone was trying to solve was, how do you drown someone in the bath? Because there were no other marks on these women's bodies. There were no bruises from being held down. There were no head injuries. And so Sir Bernard Spilsbury actually carried out an experiment to try and show how this was possible. And this is something that David Wilson also did for you.
Yes, Professor David Wilson. What we did was we got a poor, unfortunate young lady and put her in a bath without water, fortunately, in the bath. And David Wilson showed us exactly how George Smith had carried out these murders. So clever. When his wife was in the bath, he would simply reach over, grab her ankles, and suddenly yank them. So she would be pulled under the water, be unable to do anything about it. The water would fill her lungs. She would drown. But there were no suspicious marks on her body at all. It was actually quite cleverly thought out.
Because actually the shock, if you think about the shock of being pulled underwater unexpectedly, is you would gasp.
Yes.
And you would immediately inhale water. So there wouldn't even be a great deal of struggle. There wouldn't really be any time.
No, and these were, women. They weren't muscle-bound men or anything like that. These were vulnerable women, suddenly yanked completely unexpectedly under the water, lungs full of water. They were going to die.
As you can see, if I just showed demonstrating through Annabelle, it'd be very difficult to push a head beneath the water. Also, if I did so, then Annabelle could writhe around, she could shout, she could cause people to come to her aid. Now, that's the last thing Smith wants. So he develops a technique that allows him to get these women, his brides, under the water without them struggling.
Show me how he did it.
Okay, let me just change places for a second, Fred. And so he would reach under the water, grab hold of the ankles and pull! And as you can see...
Head straight underneath the water.
Try and get up, Annabelle. Try and see how difficult it is, even in an empty bath, for Annabelle to get up. I've pulled her legs above the taps. Her head's below the water. She can't struggle out of this position. And it's in this position that she drowns. And it's this demonstration by Spilsbury that's the beginning of the end for George Joseph Smith.
The incredible thing is, Sir Bernard Spilsbury's victim in his experiment was apparently a very strong swimmer, and yet the experiment almost killed her. She had to be revived.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very close shave indeed, because he'd worked out in his own mind how George Smith had done it, tried it on his own victim, as it were, his own guinea pig, and very nearly drowned her, which is why in Professor David Wilson's experiment we had the bath and the lady, but no water.
That seems very wise.
Yes,
Health and
it
safety
turned out.
first. So it came to trial in June of that year, 1915, and it was at the Old Bailey, and it was a huge furore. It was almost, serial killers are not that common, and, this kind of glamour of this idea of marrying someone and then immediately killing them for their money, it's quite a tantalising idea.
Yes, massive press publicity, given, the time it was. There was a lot of press publicity, a lot of interest in it, because serial killers weren't that common. And they were also allowed, unusually, to introduce evidence from all three of the different murders.
And I think that's probably quite crucial, this similar fact evidence. He was only being tried for Bessie Mundy's murder.
Yeah.
But they were allowed to introduce the deaths of his two other wives.
Yes.
Which is something that doesn't happen very often in criminal trials, to bring in things, to bring in cases that are not directly related to what's being tried.
Yeah.
But it was necessary because this was a very circumstantial case, despite, Sir Bernard Spilsbury taking the stand and talking about his experiments and all of this sort of pseudoscience. There wasn't a great deal of evidence.
No, Spilsbury was obviously a very, very strong personality. A man of great oratorial skills, a very clever man indeed. So, yes, they had to tie all three cases together. The trial lasted for 8 days, but it took the jury just 22 minutes to find George Smith guilty of murder.
The prosecution did throw everything that they had at this case, circumstantial though it were. They called 112 witnesses.
It is extraordinary, and yet the whole thing was over in 8 days, which seems quite amazing.
And for me, one of the most fascinating things about this case is that it really set a precedent for calling expert witnesses to give very technical scientific evidence on the stand, which is something that hadn't occurred to this extent before.
But happened a lot, obviously, after that. So yes, it did set a major precedent.
So he was sentenced to be hanged. He appealed. It wasn't successful.
Indeed, and he was hanged, deservedly so. George Joseph Smith, serial bigamist, serial killer, got what he deserved.
A really horrible character.
Yes, he was.
Thank you so much, Fred. That's all from us, but we will see you next time for more of Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook Reopened.
Bye.